frozen on a mountain of snow and ice. They were stuck in the frozen plains of the continental planet known as Mysticism. After many battles in the north, our outfit has changed crew members, but two always remain. Abath Diabolical, Lord of Salt and Frost, and Demonaz Diabolical, Lord of Axe and Snow. And thus 2 trillion years back ago from now, they unfroze their mountaintop of future and descended upon the unsuspecting world, wielding diabolical full-moon mysticism. Zezam!
In 1992, early Norwegian black metal pioneers Immortal released their debut album with the greatest album title ever, might I add, Diabolical Fullmoon Mysticism. Now, Immortal gets a bad reputation for being kinda silly, and a lot of people call them the Kiss of black metal. In some ways, I can kinda see it because they pose in hilarious positions of like the full band on just about all of their album covers, a lot like Kiss does. But they can be pretty serious, and when they're serious, they're very good. Musically, most of the time, they're serious, with the exception of lyrically every song, of course, being about snow and demons and snow and stuff like that. And speaking of lyrics, Immortal has a tendency to make all their albums part of like a giant concept about some frost world known as Bleishrik. However, that is not really the main focus or main theme of the first 2 albums. Diabolical Fullmoon Mysticism kind of more focuses on just living in Norway, the snows of Norway, and of course, paganism. Now, early Immortal is very different from late Immortal. Both of them have black metal tendencies, but later Immortal kind of goes for more of a thrash feel, and that change happens when Abath goes on guitar instead of Demonaz. But the early Immortal stuff, of course, has Demonaz on guitar, and Abath, our Lord and Savior of silliness, on bass and vocals. And Abath has some very awesome, unique black metal vocals that sound like a croaking frog. A demon frog, of course. Even though Abath is kind of a goofball, I gotta say, I definitely respect him more than some of the other assholes in the scene. Now, like a lot of the other Norwegian bands that got direct inspiration from the awesome band Bathory, Bathory was pretty much Abath's favorite band. He would always wear shirts from Bathory. He'd always blow fire like Quorthon used to do in the very few times he played live. He was completely a Quorthon worshiper, and that kind of translates on this album. Now, a lot of Immortal's albums are very, very different from one another. They start to sound more samey later on the road when they kind of go to thrash metal. But this album sounds very, very different from the other black metal albums at the time. A lot of other bands have that very lo-fi, very incredibly fast with blast beats, terrible buzzy production that sounds like they stuck a tape recorder in a fucking beehive. This album sounds different. It sounds very, very cold and very evil without having to do that exact sound. Instead, it has a very, very muddy, low sound that sounds extremely cold. While a lot of other bands got direct inspiration from like Under the Sign of the Black Mark, it seems like Immortal was borrowing inspiration from The Return of Darkness and Evil, which is a very, very interesting direction, making this easily one of my most favorite black metal albums and one of my favorite albums from Immortal, probably second or first favorite. Not many black metal albums really sound like this one, and even though they are considered total goofballs and some consider them an embarrassment to the genre, there's no denying how awesome and how serious and evil this album is. But of course, everyone remembers this era for the ridiculously goofy Call of the Winter Moon music video, where they're all just walking around a forest, making mean faces at each other and blowing fire. But every single song in this album is extremely memorable and extremely well written. A lot of it's at more of a mid-pace as opposed to a ridiculously fast pace. So if you're itching to get into black metal but you just can't figure it out and it's all just too fast, too noisy, I'd probably recommend starting with this album, considering it's not a gang rape of your eardrums. The song Unholy Forces of Evil features a Both doing some incredibly evil croaks, evil vocals that sacrifice your ears in the name of diabolical Fullmoon mysticism. My favorite song is probably Cold Winds of Funeral Dust. It's kind of at a slower pace, but it's very, very catchy. The most interesting song is the final song, A Perfect Vision of Rising Northland, and they're especially showing the Bathory influence in this song. This song is similar to the Viking black metal direction that Korthen took in the late 80s. (1993's black metal classic Pure Holocaust is another front to back, stick a fork in a power outlet classic. This one is definitely more closely related to other black metal classics from everyone else in the scene, but I have to criticize the fact that The Sun No Longer Rises and Frozen by Ice Winds. Both those songs have a pretty identical riff, which is weird considering they're back to back. I don't know why they didn't just separate them across the track listing, but whatever. Now, Demonaz and Abath got rid of their drummer that was on Diabolical Fullmoon Mysticism, known as Armageddon. They actually feature a third guy on the artwork named Grim, which is credited for doing the drums and stuff, but he didn't do anything on the album at all. Now, it's crazy to think that they had Abath do drums in this one, because the drumming is way faster on this album. My favorite songs are the faster songs in the album: Unsilenced Storms in the North Abyss, Pure Holocaust. I mean, come on, what song called Storming Through Red Clouds and Holocaust Winds wouldn't be absolutely amazing? Now, Battles in the North is a very, very interesting album, which came out 2 years after Pure Holocaust. They decided to be themselves again and sound completely different from everyone else. This time on the artwork, it just features Demonaz and Abath. Demonaz is still on guitar, Abath is still on bass and drums. But what's interesting is, even though Abath sounded very good on the last album drumming-wise, you didn't really notice too many problems. You could argue maybe it's because of the really trebly lo-fi production, but on this album, they have a really weird production where the drums and vocals are very, very loud in the mix, and the guitars and bass are kind of muddy along with it, which I've grown to really appreciate because it actually creates this really, really, really blizzardy atmosphere where it sounds like you're in the middle of a blizzard because it sounds so chaotic. But I gotta say, now that the drums are so high in the mix, everything sounds extremely rushed and off time. The drumming from Abath especially, good God, he misses so many beats, it's extremely noticeable. But all of a sudden on the second half of the album, it seems like tempo and everything is starting to fall into place. So I don't know what the hell happened on the first half of the album. Even the guitars and everything just sound off time, which is a terrible thing about this album, let's be honest. It is a legitimate criticism. I mean, even though it's raw, you gotta keep things on time and tight, or else it just sounds like a mess. And some of these songs is just an absolute mess, like Descent into Eminent Silence. But that's kind of the novelty of this album, is that it's just so raw, all over the place and crazy, that I went from hating this album to really, really liking it now. But like I said, the real big strengths on this album lie in the second half, like songs like Moonrise, Fields of Sorrow, Cursed Realms of the Winter Demons, and my favorite song, of course, the beginning of the concept of the mighty land of Bleishrick, the title song, Bleishrick Mighty Raven Dark. And thus begins the never-ending discussion of the hellish, freezing, war-torn battlefields of Bleishrick.
Far above the raining gate,
1997's Blizzard Beast, just like the album before it, this one is very, very weird for black metal. This time around, they have an actual drummer, Horg, who does a really, really good job. But the songwriting and production are very, very weird. This album is very short. I'd say reminiscent of something like Rain and Blood. But the rest of it reminds me of death metal. I don't know what it is, but the production sounds a lot like Scott Burns. But for the most part, the songs are still pretty strong. But I'd say it's one of their weaker albums because that shitty production. And some of the songs towards the end of the album start to really sound dull. I mean, the first half is very, very strong. We get to like track 7, 8, and 9. And you just get some really dull, uninspired songwriting. However, I do kind of like the chorus of Frost Demon Storm. That's a pretty good chorus. And I love the dynamic Horg adds to the band, especially on songs like Nebular Raven's Winter. During the chorus, his drumming sounds tight, but it puts you on edge because sometimes it sounds a little off, but off on purpose to make it sound like you're about to fall off a snowy mountain.
Black ravens cry for journeys to come, looking with snowfall. But you may drag the ropes of ice, frozen of heart, you know.
1999's At the Heart of Winter is a stone-cold classic. All punch intended. This is one of the few album arts in the band that doesn't actually have the band members on there. I never really liked the artwork that much because I thought it looked cheesier than them just standing there posing like idiots, believe it or not. Now this album sparks the big change musically for Immortal. Now they would go for a direction that would kind of be the same thing for the next 4 albums, although changing things up a little bit. Before, every album they made was so ridiculously different within the realms of black metal. Now they were kind of settling down into this blackened thrash style, which they definitely innovated. And that change happened because Demonaz Doom Occulta, our guitarist and lyricist, developed tendinitis in his hand, so he couldn't play guitar anymore or really do any of the instruments. I don't know why he didn't just do the vocals, because his vocals are kind of similar to Abath's, but he just ended up doing lyrics. So on this album, with the exception of Horg doing drums, Abath pretty much does everything. He writes all the music, he does the guitars now, and in some ways he's actually a better guitar player than Demonaz, or at least is a more noticeable guitar player. And he does some really good riffs and technical playing on this album. And these modern Immortal albums are definitely more catchy, more riff-oriented, and seems like they're more technical compared to the other stuff, which is a lot more in-your-face, a lot more brutal, a lot more true cult. But I gotta say, even though this is considered a classic and is still very good, I prefer a lot of the earlier albums like Diabolical, Pure Holocaust, and even one of the albums that come out after it more than this album. It's actually one of my lesser favorite Immortal albums. I just find a lot of this album that kind of go over my head as like, well, it's catchy and you can tap your foot to it and it's kind of memorable and melodic, but honestly it's just not that great to me. I think there's actually some pretty weak moments, especially the last song on this album, Years of Silent Sorrow, just never did anything for me.
Dome in the sky, black winter days, shadows pyramids, lead my way.
And then a lot of the other songs are good but not great, but I gotta give some props to the awesome epic songs, Tragedies, Blows at Horizon, which is pretty good. I love the slow melodic parts, but the best song, and one of the best songs from the band, is the title track from the album At the Heart of Winter. After At the Heart of Winter, Immortal decided to get much worse. Now, it's not terrible, but I just find this album to be very, very mediocre. Damned in Black continued the cringy band on the front cover of the album doing stupid poses. And they got a bass player for this album though, so Both could just do guitar and vocals. A guy named Asakara or something like that. This album, they go very, very thrashy and extremely generic. There's hardly any moments that I really hold as incredible Immortal moments, with the exception, of course, of the final song, the title track, which is one of their best songs. Damned in Black is one hell of a way to end such a mediocre album. But talk about night and day, the worst song is probably the first one, Triumph. It's just absolute monotony until like way later in the song you finally get a riff that doesn't just suck ass. Like a lot of the thrash era stuff, I used to love this album and think it was one of the best ones, but man have I gotten sick of it. I just find it incredibly boring, even though it's such a short album. However, like I said, there are some really good moments, especially the title track. After what the last album did, you'd think 2002's Sons of the Northern Darkness would just be absolutely generic and shitty, right? But that's completely incorrect. Sons of the Northern Darkness somehow takes this generic, boring style that already has gotten terrible and old on the last album and somehow makes it good. The production is very, very good. So if you want good black metal, like good production and stuff like that, go for this album. I mean, I think the bad production's kind of the point and kind of a novelty to black metal, but this album breaks so many barriers by having very, very good nuclear blast style production. The album cover features the band members doing ridiculous poses again, but it definitely looks a lot better than Damned in Black and kind of conveys that feel throughout the album of this very cold, war-torn landscapes of Bleeshrick. And the atmosphere on this album is very strong. Now, they have always been a band to keep consistently good atmosphere. Miss a couple times, like Damned in Black, I gotta say. That's just noise and crap. These songs sound extremely well developed, and the atmosphere is better than it ever was. It really makes you feel like you're in a cold tundra. Front to back, this album just has absolute 10 out of 10 songs. The first 4 songs are kind of the shorter songs in the album. With the exception of one of the songs, they're all pretty fast, very catchy, very in your face, but very, very good riffs that are very much black metal. Especially the verse of Dominion, it really proves that you can do black metal and be very catchy with it. But speaking of catchiness, the longer song in the first half that has a very slow pace is one of the absolute best black metal songs I've ever heard. Tyrants is absolutely essential. Easily my favorite song from the band, but it just keeps getting better. In the last 4 songs of the album, we have nothing but epic songs. Within a Dark Mind has a great, consistent melody to it, and My Kingdom Cold is based off of the H.P. Lovecraft story At the Mountains of Madness. And just like every other song on this album, they avoid cheesiness lyrics-wise and actually go for well-told stories and well-told themes, especially on this song, which has a lot of really great riffs, but the lyrics are what drives this song. Antarctica, which has absolutely incredible, draws you in with its coldness atmosphere. But I absolutely adore the way the album ends with the final epic, Beyond the North Ways, which is very similar once again to the old Bathory Viking black metal songs like Into the Eternal Fire.
On many ships I have sailed, far beyond the north ways, the height of the seas, and we have found our way.
They stereotype if you're a Norwegian black metal band, oh, you're bad, you hurt people, and you burn churches and all that stuff.
You know, we hurt people with our music. That's what we do. You know, we don't go around attacking people or burning shit down, you know. But if someone, you know, if you want to attack me, go ahead. The reason we never, you know, were involved in the church burning, because if you burn a church, the government built it up again. You know, and the government takes our money to build it up. So, you know, we were never part of any of those side activities. You know, also, you know, politics. You know, all that shit. You know, it's like.
You want to deny the world hearing your music?
We're living in our own world, you know. We don't want to, you know, end up in jail.
Our ice generals of immortality awoke from their slumber, descended upon the world, and proclaimed, all shall fall, all.
Immortal fans had to wait such a long time for this album to come out, but when it came out, it was critically acclaimed, it had a really good production, but it's gotten kind of forgotten, and I can tell why. It's honestly, it's good, okay? There's nothing bad about this album, but it's not very great. I mean, honestly, the couple songs that I really take away from this album that I find strong, but not even as strong as stuff from like Sons of the Northern Darkness, is Hordes to War, which is pretty awesome, and Unearthly Kingdom, which is the very last Immortal song ever. Very cool, epic.
Entering the sacred world of light, to where the stormy kingdom home.
But other than that, it just has such a been there, done that feel that it really makes this album boring after a while, which is really sad to say, because it is pretty decent, especially once again if you want to hear some black metal with good production. I would recommend this one, but man, I would probably even rather listen to like At the Heart of Winter over this. I just think it gets so boring after a while. A lot of the riffs are kind of the same throughout. A lot of it's kind of that mid-tempo, we're so epic and melodic catchiness. It's just the same tired shit that they've already done before. But they're just beating the dead horse with this album, which I'm kind of glad that this is the last Immortal album, hopefully, because they went out on a good note, not a great note, but hey, it could have been much worse compared to how a lot of other black metal bands seem to be going out now. Burzum. Now they get a different bass player on this album. They have this guy named Apollyon, but after waiting forever again to make another album, instead, the band split up. There was a lawsuit over who had the rights to the band Immortal after Abath left the band because Demonaz was taking a huge amount of the pay for only really writing the lyrics and doing a shitty job as manager. So I can understand Abath's side, and I'm all for his side of the argument. You know, Abath at this point had pretty much done everything while Demonaz really did nothing. But now Demonaz has the rights to the name Immortal, and I honestly don't want to see what Immortal would turn into without Abath. But what's interesting is since All Shall Fall, both members have released solo albums. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about them, but let's just talk about them quick. Now, like I've said, I am on Abath's side, and I definitely think he's probably the more creative driving force throughout Immortal's whole discography, and I definitely prefer him over Demonaz. But I just gotta say, dude, Abath's solo album is absolute garbage. Which is crazy because Demonaz's album, a guy that I completely don't agree with, and a guy that probably had a hard time writing some of the music because of his tendinitis, that is if he even wrote the music, did an album of mostly slow, epic Viking metal type of stuff. And if you ask me which I'd prefer, Abath doing a classic, chaotic black metal style, or Demonaz doing slow, epic Viking metal stuff, I'd probably say, well, duh, Abath. But it's just so weird that his album is so generic and so shitty, while Demonaz's album is actually pretty good. I don't know how he pulled it off, but the album is very, very catchy, kind of unique, some places generic, but I'd say probably better than like All Shall Fall. So, I mean, I kind of want to see what Demonaz can do, but I bet you a lot of the songs that were written were probably songs he'd been sitting on for a really long time, so I probably couldn't really see him doing any more solo albums, but hopefully both parties just leave the Immortal name to rest, and hopefully Abath can ditch the idiot King of Hell that he has in his band and actually produce something that's worth listening to.